Week 6, Derek Walcott's Omeros in relation to the Odyssey, and a look at the Hades and Ithaca episodes, maybe also Oxen of the Sun. And I want to start today with an invocation of the muse, as we've often been doing in this class, as we kind of keep returning to, but not Homer's muse this time. This time with a muse that Derek Walcott calls the muse of history. Here is the opening argument of that essay. The common experience of the New World, even for its patrician writers, whose veneration of the old is read as the idolatry of the mestizo, is colonialism. Even if you're in the dominant class and you have some kind of praise or idolatry for the tradition of the colonizing culture, of the imperial culture, you too have to reckon with the history of colonialism. This is the muse of history that kind of that Walcott wants to worry about in this essay. They too are victims of tradition, but they remind us of our debt to the great dead, that those who break a tradition first hold it in awe. We're already dealing with the tension of different ways of thinking about what a poet like Homer might mean in the Caribbean to a poet like Walcott. They know, again, the patrician writers, that by openly fighting tradition, we perpetuate it. That revolutionary literature, to take up a different camp, a different post-colonial or colonial impulse, is a filial impulse, and that maturity is the assimilation of the features of every ancestor. In the New World, servitude to the muse of history has produced a literature of recrimination and despair, a literature of revenge, written by the descendants of slaves, or a literature of remorse, written by the descendants of masters. And what I'm suggesting here with the color coding, of course, is that we can identify at least two camps of ways of thinking about the relationship to a European literary tradition in this context. Revenge and remorse, revolutionary literature, or idolatrous patrician literature. Maybe there is a third way. That's what Walcott's going to suggest. The great poets of the New World, from Whitman to Neruda, reject this sense of history. Their vision of man in the New World is Adamic, might also say maybe Edenic. In their exuberance, he is still capable of enormous wonder, yet he has paid his accounts to Greece and Rome and walks in a world without monuments and ruins. So Walcott's writing with a sort of confident authority when he makes these pronouncements, but there's a persistent problem that he's grappling with, and I think he's only able to kind of allude to what the solution might feel like or look like by way of these poetic references. And that question, that problem is, how exactly should a post-colonial writer contend with the history and tradition that lies behind him while still writing about a new world as though it is a new Eden? What exactly does it mean to start in a new, fresh world and to have this history behind you? And as we see in the colors, Walcott looks around at a New World literature and sees that there have been three kinds of responses to this. That there is this literature of idolatry that we might associate with sort of the dominant class, the class that has benefited from colonialism in one way or another, the patrician writers who are in awe of that tradition, or maybe at their on the other side of things are remorseful about the way in which they are attached to that tradition. Then on the other hand, that we have a literature of revenge, people who want to write back against the empire. The empire writes back in the Rushdie phrase, with revolutionary literature that is trying to take down that tradition with something else, something alternative. And then whatever this particular New World Adamic literature might be or might mean. And we'll talk about that, I think, in the discussion today, as what that looks like in Walcott's case. And I divide it into these three categories, partly because I think that's what Walcott's doing in his essay, but also because it happens to align very nicely with what other Caribbean intellectuals have been doing throughout the 20th century in terms of trying to reckon with this same problem. So one of the poets that Walcott references in the Muse of History essay, as Samir was mentioning, Aimé Césaire, also has a kind of tripartite distinction of ways of reckoning with what the new literature coming out of the Caribbean should do. That there is often going to be an intellectual class, Césaire recognized at the beginning of the 20th century too, that is prone to taking the authority of the imperial metropole as its guide, as its North Star, and then you get these French-influenced, colored, petit bourgeois type of poets whose fundamental tendency is to ape what is coming out of Europe and gain their legitimacy that way. Or you could have a more combative approach to literature and turn to a kind of black surrealism that is still taking something from France in this particular case, but something that was more revolutionary within the French modernist 20th century context, using it as a weapon to explode the French language, as Parisians had also done, but then to treat your own unconscious, that you have to dredge, your own dream world that you have to awaken, as a call to Africa, to what is fundamentally black. So a black version of that Parisian surrealism. And then Césaire comes up again with a sort of third category that is his sort of manifesto category, his creed, which is this concept of négritude, a way of living history within history that constitutes a heritage, a voice for a retrieved identity, are some of the things that he says about this concept, which is a poetic concept for him, becomes a political concept for other collaborators. In Césaire's case, it's generally an idea of a pan-African culture, that there is a diasporic blackness that could be the source of something that gets you out of this problem of history and tradition by connecting you to a wider world that is not the European world. So not quite the New World solution, right? Because in a way, it requires going back to the Old World, just not the Old World that is Europe. And then, in an essay that I recommended for this week on national culture from within the wretched of the earth, Frantz Fanon's famous work about revolution, Fanon suggests that there are similarly three phases that intellectuals go through, maybe even within one life, that one poet or one might go through these phases, or at least one generation or successive generations might go through these kinds of phases, and that this is sort of a progression towards what national literature has to move through to come into itself. That we have first a metropolitan literature, so using the idea of the metropole in its etymological sense as the mother city, the imperial city. That first the colonized intellectual proves he has assimilated the colonizer's culture. He tries to earn the respect of the colonizer by mimicking it. His works correspond point by point with those of his metropolitan counterparts, so the writers in London or the writers in France. Then a pre-combat literature, a second stage in which the colonized writer decides to cast his mind back. Old childhood memories will resurface, old legends be reinterpreted on the basis of a borrowed aesthetic. We were talking about this a little bit in the office hours on the way into class, that one solution is to go back to a pre-colonial culture, to indigenous culture, to the kinds of things that one has had erased for one's culture, and to reclaim them and revive them, even if one's been relocated to a different continent where those cultures maybe are not part of the earth. And then finally, a combat literature, which for Fanon has to be the final step, and the step that aligns artistic revolution with political revolution. A third stage, a combat stage, where the colonized writer turns into a galvanizer of the people. Combat literature, revolutionary literature, national literature emerges. And the point of putting these columns together and staggering them such is not to make them a match. I've tried to give them a different slant and a different shading appropriately. These are not all the same set of three ideas, but these are three different intellectuals from more or less the same original milieu who are trying to reckon with the different paths they take. They can take the different courses they can chart with regard to the history in which they've been brought up and the literature they want to write. The interesting column for our purposes is the purple column, where Fanon advocates for a national literature to forge a new culture of self-determination and independence, and where Césaire advocates instead for a diasporic literature to acknowledge a shared heritage of black intellectual thought around the world. Walcott uses a different geographic scale, so not just the national border or the black diaspora, but the continent of the New World, the continent of the Americas, to have your affinities with Pablo Neruda in Chile or with Walt Whitman in America, because you feel your project is somehow the same across races but joined by a landmass. Fanon and Césaire's categories have the value of being a little bit clearer. We're here to create a national identity, or we're here to create a Pan-African racial identity. Walcott's, I think, is a little bit more mysterious. Like, we have to look at how Omeros functions to understand what it would actually consist of. What is this Adamic or Edenic or New World literature exactly? That art might have three directions. I think is also suggested in the title of Walcott's epic, which Walcott breaks down into three parts. I think, Peter, you wrote about this particular passage. When we get a description of why Walcott chose this title, I said Omeros, and O was the conscious shell invocation, Mer was both mother and sea in our Antillean patois, and Os, a gray bone, was and the winter surf as it crashes. So in terms of the columns we were just considering, the different paths that you might have through literature, What do you make of this three-part division of Omeros? Great, so one thing we could say is in spite of the fact that we've splintered the idea of Homer and the Greek name of Homer into all these different associations and all these different sounds, in fact, they are reunified by the fact that they all evoke a common place. So we might say that to begin with, just choosing Omeros as a title for this project and as something to break down in the first place is a kind of deference to a metropolitan literature or to a European literature that then we break apart, maybe violently, in a sort of combat or pre-combat stage to try to find something indigenous as a way of taking it over, and then we ultimately end up with something new and something national. You can also even see that process happening just within the word mère itself, that we start with this word that Walcott plays with as French, right? Mère as the sea or as a mother, and then takes it to mother, but then mother also suggests something more personal, more indigenous, my mother, my line of mothers, and then finally becomes the patois, becomes the hybrid, becomes the integrated. So even within the one subunit, we're able to go through certain kinds of phases of different approaches to literature. Yeah, good. I like the tension there also just in the pronouns or in the characters, that we start with the I of the poet who, like Homer, is going to allow a god to speak through him, and that god for Walcott turns out to be Homer, or ancient Greece maybe, or Europe. And yet, by way of that transmutation of being brought through him, it goes from the first person to the singular to the first person plural. We go from I to our, which suggests, again, the possibility of a national literature, a collective literature, perhaps. Yeah, great. So os is onomatopoetic. It does still have that muse of history problem a little bit to it, insofar as os in French, again, to borrow from this European foreign literature that's been grafted into the Caribbean by war and by conquest, also means bone. And the idea of bones being the white surf lines that are crashing against the coast is going to bring to mind the Middle Passage and the bones that are beneath the waves that Achille is going to dive down to see, right? So there is this way in which, again, the natural world is a kind of antidote, maybe, if bones can turn into surf, but that trauma, that historical problem remains. And this is going to be a poem about the Middle Passage, even as it tries to be a poem about a new world that grows, in spite of and after that. One way we could kind of take the different associations and pull them apart, perhaps, is to say that yes, because we have an invocation of Homer, because it is playing with the Homeric muse, because we are playing with French, there are all these different ways in which the metropole does loom large over a passage like this, and therefore over a project like this. Because on the other hand, we are interested in our particular ancestry for Walcott, in our own mothers, in the bones of those who didn't make it, in the histories of the crashes, of the warfare that took place outside this island. Maybe there is some kind of revolutionary, kind of anti-imperial impulse here that is a literature of revenge of a certain kind. And yet, on top of all of that, there's also pure music and pure nature, right? The sound of the conch shell when you blow into it, the patois that is a kind of bringing together of different cultures that makes something utterly unique, and the sea itself, which is sort of a horizon of opportunity that is not necessarily restrained. So much of this multilingual game that Walcott is playing with its Greek and its English and its French along with the patois suggests an integration of cultures, and that is how Walcott ends the Muse of History essay by saying, I accept this archipelago of the Americas. I give the strange and bitter the bitter and yet ennobling thanks for the monumental groaning and soldering of two great worlds like the halves of a fruit seamed by its own bitter juice, that exiled from your own Edens, you have placed me in the wonder of another, and that was my inheritance and your gift. As Walcott says earlier in the essay, the fruit of knowledge in this new Eden is acid and sweet with the tartness of experience. And so what I want to hold on to at this juncture, and this has come up already a little bit, is how Walcott breaks apart the pieces of a single name, a single word, a single concept for a project, a single continent, an entire continent, and then puts them back together. Around the seeming juice. That's going to be our guiding principle for working through the different pieces of this poem in the lecture, which is also going to break it into parts and then try to put it back together. So here are our motivating questions for today's lecture in the template that we've been following all along. How does the post-colonial poet, generally speaking, create a new world out of old ones? Césaire, Fanon, Walcott all have different answers to that question. And after Derek Walcott faces the Hades of history, After all, going into Hades is going into history. That's what we experience in the Odyssey. That's what we experience in the Inferno. That is what the katabasis is about. It's about going to meet your ancestors. What does he find in the Ithaca of St. Lucia, the homeland? And our outline is going to follow the logic of the categories, those blue, red, and purple categories that we've been discussing, starting with the trip to metropolitan Europe, then to pre-colonial Africa, and finally to the New World. So in parts 1 through 3, to keep things efficient, I'm going to just pick one passage per section. We'll try to kind of move quickly, but after a lecture, we can go back and revisit each of those locations and see what Walcott does with them. As I was teasing before class, I now want to build into these lectures not just the architecture of how you arrive at a final argument, about Omeros in this case, as we will do at the end of part 3, but also how you might write a conclusion after that, how you might then bring it all back to Homer and say something speculative that allows Walcott to let us look back. Okay, so following that structure, let's jump ahead to book 5 of Omeros, since it matches the first column in our schema of post-colonial culture, the colonized intellectual's journey to the metropole, as Walcott later in his career, having had some success, finally got to travel and visit some of the things he had only heard about and read about and kind of confront them and think about them. What generally did you take Walcott to be looking for in Europe? Like, what did you make of his travel itinerary, the things he pays attention to? What kind of Odyssey is this? So yeah, the stop I want to dwell on, in fitting with the class, is Walcott's look at the Aegean when he finally arrives there. And I think generally it's fair to say that the trip through Europe, insofar as it's maybe being selective about whether Shakespeare is really a priority, is about these places where one way or another he's able to make connections to Homer, whether it's the Strait of Gibraltar, where Odysseus is purported to have sailed, whether it's these places that have Ulyssean or Odyssean allusions, like Lisbon as Ulyssibona, or the way in which Walcott got access to Homer by way of English translations, so therefore meeting Homer at Charing Cross in London. But yeah, let's go to the Aegean. So let's just start with the beginning verses here, when this vision kind of kicks off. On the scorched deck, Odysseus hears the hill music through the wormholes of the mast. The sail clings like a butterfly to the elbow of an olive branch, a bride on her father's arm scared of her future. On its tired shadow, the prow turns slowly, uncertain of its aim. He peels his sunburnt skin in maps of gray parchment, which he scrolls away absently between finger and thumb. The crew stare like statues at that feigned detachment whose heart in its ribs thuds like the galley slave's drum. What do you read into this as a vision of Odysseus? Yeah, good. Okay, so in spite of the fact that this is one epic looking at another, it weirdly has the effect of finding in the overlap a lyric moment where we sort of wonder about the feelings and personal psychology of Odysseus. Yeah, wonderful. Great. So insofar as he is seeing a captain of a crew whose skin is peeling away under his fingers, it almost feels like a ghost ship, which is appropriate for a ghostly shade of a world that no longer exists and a trireme that is no longer on the Aegean. That's nice. Where is Walcott in this scene? Just the detached observer, kind of trying to cast his mind back to what this looked like 3,000 years ago? There's something that's suggested about the phrases that I've highlighted in gold, I think, about Walcott's, attempt to travel through time and what that actually means. I think for somebody writing in the 1990s, the word wormholes is suggestive not just of literal wormholes, but the opportunity to kind of go back into the past that he's pursuing. Then if he's going to kind of take this whole cycle of coming back, he's interested in sort of what will be the legacy of this particular ship and this particular crew. A bride on her father's arm scared of its future, a ship whose prow is uncertain of its aim. In one way or another, I think he's curious as to if he casts himself back into this world, what it will give him back when he comes back to the present, something that Achille is also dealing with in his dream return to Africa. Maybe this is projecting a little bit too much, or being a little bit too superficial in my search for details that might connect Walcott to Odysseus, but there's something about this literary pilgrimage and identifying with all these great European writers from somebody who recognizes the challenge of being respected and acknowledged and embraced by that culture as a black man from the Caribbean, where I look at a detail like Odysseus peeling his sunburnt skin in maps of gray parchment and then rolling them off his skin. That certainly evokes a sailor who's been out at sea and whose skin may well have changed color, but also makes me think about the importance of skin and race to this encounter that is happening between a black Caribbean man and a white Greek hero. That I wonder if Walcott is, at least for the moment, identifying himself with Odysseus, if part of the fantasy is to peel off your skin, is to be skinless, to move into the literary universal, where you might as well be Odysseus in this story, and your own racial place or situation in the world shouldn't matter, that you should be able to identify with this traveler in the midst of your own travels. And yet, if that's the case, then there's something anxious going on in the heart of Odysseus, in the heart of Walcott, that the detachment of being skinless, the detachment of being universal, the detachment of being above history is feigned, is maybe not totally convincing, and that there is a beating that is happening in the heart that rebels against it, and that is going to move us from Odysseus to the crew. So, the crew's response. Hunched on their oars, they smile. This is we, Calypso, Captain, who treat we like swine. You ain't seeing shore. Let this sun burn you black and blister your lips so it hurt them to give orders. Fuck you and your war. The mattock rests idle. No oar lifts a finger. Blisters flower on palms. The bewildered trireme is turning the wrong way, like the cloud-eyed singer whose hand plucked the sea's wires, back towards the dream of Helen, back to that island where their hunched spine bristled and they forged the middens of Circe, when her long white arm poured out the enchanting wine and they bucked in cool sheets. Captain boy, beg mercy of that breeze for a change, because sometimes your heart is as hard as that mast. You dream of Ithaca, you pray to your gods. May they be as far apart from your wandering as ours in Africa. Island after island passing, still we ain't home. So what's going on now? What is the rejoinder from the crew? It is ascribing a lot to the crew, who we do see rebelling against Odysseus in this particular section of the Odyssey, right? The Oxen of the Sun episode involves some of that. We're condensing so much of the Odyssey in this particular. We've got Circe, we've got Calypso, we've got the Sirens, we've got Aeolus, we've got the rebellion of Oxen of the Sun, perhaps. Ceiling. So why this is we, Calypso? So for one thing, to have the kind of little joke to one more episode in the Odyssey, but for another, we do have to reckon with the fact that this is different kinds of music that are playing off each other. As we were suggesting before, there's the music of the Sirens maybe that Odysseus is drawn to, but there's also the kind of galley slave drum pounding in his heart, and indeed maybe pounding on the boat as well. So there's different musical strains that I think are pulling at us in this particular passage. And Walcott has some fun with this at different parts of Omeros, where in Book 7 he describes hearing Homer's dactylic hexameter, the da-da-dum, 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 dum-dum, 6-beat line, andromoi, enepe, musa, etc., Homeric line that Homer's very famous for, as being in some way transposable musically into a music form that exists in the Caribbean, that is also a triplicate form, which is calypso music. So if Homer's dactylic hexameter starts with the stress, with the dactyl of the finger, the long joint, and then the two short joints, calypso tends to be the opposite in terms of its particular rhythmic structure, ch-ch-chum, 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 chum-chum, as opposed to dum-da-dum-dum-da-dum-da-dum-dum. So there might be some opportunity here to actually show the tension of two different musical forms, and indeed two different continental or cultural musical traditions, poetic traditions, lyrical traditions, kind of playing with each other, the dactylic and the anapestic. If we look at the moment where the crew's song resumes with the Captain boy beg mercy of that breeze for a change, I think what we see, in fact, is that Walcott, as the kind of maestro that he is able to use both forms together, in fact alternating between the two halves of the line to show that he can do the calypso rhythm and the dactylic hexameter forms, or as it were the anapest and the dactyl forms together. Oh, that breeze for a change, because sometimes your heart is as hard as that mast. You dream of Ithaca, you pray to your gods, may they be as far apart from your wandering as ours in Africa. Now, it's not perfect, as with everything that Walcott is doing metrically here. He's not doing a perfect terza rima in Dante's form, and not doing a perfect dactylic hexameter. He's still a 1990s modern poet who wants the freedom of some degree of flexibility, something Whitmanian even, perhaps. But nevertheless, I think there's something deliberate happening here with the caesura, this kind of dashed purple line around the two commas in the period, where the lines are being broken in half and put together with these two different rhythms. It's a really neat poetic trick, but I think it's also a personal and philosophical point. It's reminiscent of Walcott's description of New World identity, the monumental groaning and soldering of two great worlds like the halves of a fruit. Well, here are sort of two halves that Walcott is trying to figure out how metrically and musically to put together. And maybe Walcott doesn't want to be free of his skin ultimately. Maybe he wants to claim the Greek and the Caribbean, Odysseus and the crew, Europe and Africa, with a kind of tour de force like this one. So that's going to be my first answer to the opening question, the kind of initial argument, that if we're wondering how the post-colonial poet takes old worlds and forms a new one, we might say that Walcott is indeed tempted by the literature of idolatry to imagine himself as Odysseus and to go back to Europe and do a literary pilgrimage to meet these white literary ancestors and indeed white genealogical ancestors. Walcott is multiracial. And he's also tempted by the literature of revenge to imagine himself as the crew. He likes singing that version of the song too, that is taking Odysseus on. But ultimately what Walcott crafts inside his own poetry is a synthesized style that is made out of two hemispheres, what he then calls in Book 7 a Greek calypso. Okay, so much for Europe for now. Let's go back a bit in Omeros and follow Aeschyle into Africa. So let's set that up a little bit first. In what ways, we got to talk about Aeschyle and we got to talk about Hades, perhaps. In what ways is Aeschyle like the ancient Achilles? We haven't been reading the Iliad. We do get a glimpse of Achilles in this reading of the Odyssey that we did for this week. But what's going on with this Iliad character, this Aeschyle character? What are the resonances that Walcott wants to draw upon? So there's the Aeschyle-Hector fight over Helen, which is, of course, the kind of condensed version of the Trojan War. And maybe more specifically, the idea of like Hector in the Iliad. I'm not sure if this is quite right, but yeah, maybe you're onto something. Is slightly more the reluctant warrior who also is shown with his family and has other kind of demands on his affections and attentions, as opposed to Achilles, who is really there for the glory of fighting. So what about I've been teasing this idea that one of the things Walcott is interested in is playing with Hades and the descent into Hades, and of course that's where we meet Achilles in the Odyssey. Where have we generally seen Hades coming up in Omeros? Yeah, so we can jump right from the ancient Hades to the Christian hell, because as Zoe pointed out in the comments on Canvas, one of the other intertexts, one of the dominant intertexts for this poem is Dante's Divine Comedy, and maybe especially the Inferno and Purgatorio perhaps, maybe even elements of Paradiso, the whole of it, but especially the idea that one has to descend to some kind of sulfurous, fiery, and icy depths to see one's own history, as Dante does for his Florence, and as Odysseus does for his ancient Greek heroes and heroines. So Aeschyle has to do for his African ancestry, so Walcott has to do for his history of St. Lucia. Hades, like as I was saying before, Hades is the place where you go to encounter your history, your ancestral history, your cultural history. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that there are multiple ghost figures and guide figures, which in Omeros, which lead us to Odysseus and his mother, or Odysseus and Tiresias, or perhaps to Dante being guided by Virgil or by Beatrice through the various stages of the afterlife. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so lots of different moments to keep in mind. Now this is going to invite me to finally bring the Odyssey in here a little bit and take us in up close to one of the most famous episodes of all of the poem, really, but especially of the Hades adventure, where Odysseus meets Achilles, and we get these famous lines. "Don't try to sell me on death, Odysseus, in spite of the fact that Achilles has gotten the glory he always wanted. I'd rather be a hired hand back up on earth, slaving away for some poor dirt farmer, than lord it over all these withered dead." Critics have read this as a statement of purpose for the whole of the Odyssey as a poem, that if the Iliad valorizes glorious death, that Achilles makes that bargain in the Iliad, that what the Odyssey values instead is surviving and coming home. And so Achilles himself recognizes in the Odyssey that what he valued in the Iliad was wrong. This is even maybe the fodder for thinking that these are poems by two entirely separate poets who are quarreling with each other, and Homer couldn't possibly have written both and had both sets of values. In Walcott's eyes, we might also notice that Achilles is willing to choose the life of a laborer or a slave. That seems like an interesting detail for a poet reckoning with this particular history. Walcott's Achilles, after all, is a descendant of slaves and a poor fisherman who goes on to do yard work for the Plunketts. So he's kind of had that life, that continued Achilles' life, that Achilles, by dying in battle, never had. What's also important for our purposes is that Achilles' speech to Odysseus doesn't end here. This is often the part that's excerpted, and it's very memorable and poignant, but then Achilles goes on. And I'm not there for him, that is his son, up in the sunlight with the strength I had in wide Troy once when I killed Ilion's best and saved the army. Just let me come with that kind of strength to my father's house, even for an hour, and wrap my hands around his enemies' throats. They would learn what it means to face my temper. So Achilles seems confined to his fate, a little bit like, Tantalus or Sisyphus, that in spite of the fact that he may think he has changed in Hades, he's going to go through this same cycle of rage and warrior spirit that is the thing that got him killed in the first place. He thinks he could be content as a simple laborer, but he can't help wanting to be a warrior, seems to be the Achilles that we know. The scene where Achilles most lives up to his ancient namesake is a scene of battle, a scene of this kind of bloodthirsty, angry, vengeful war on behalf of one's family, in fact. In chapter 37, Achilles witnesses a war between African tribes and the capture of slaves, and he intervenes, like Homer's Achilles, in the Iliad as a warrior. But like the mythical Achilles, he is doomed to falter eventually, and the heel comes into play. The one thought thudding in him was, I can deliver all of them by hiding in a half circle. Then I could change their whole future. Even the course of the river would flow backwards, past the mangroves. Then a cord of thorn vine looped his tendon, encircling the heel with its own piercing chain. He fell hard. He saw the leaves pinned with stars. Ants crawled over Achilles as his blind eyes stared from the mud, still as the archer he had brained, the bow beside him, and the broken oar. So what is Walcott doing here in terms of integrating Homeric mythology and the actual African history? It's a metaphorical chaining to history, but it's also a manacle, right? It feels very physical and material and real, and it is quite a different way to fall by the heel than being pierced by an arrow. What other details do you read into these lines where Achilles thinks he can change history? I like that idea of Achilles, who may well have been in the Trojan horse. I don't know the lore on that, or whether he was shot and killed by Paris before that raid. That he's hiding in something so as to kind of take history from within and change it, like it's the walls of an impregnable Troy. That's great. I mean, to me, and this is just a very literary way of looking at it, I think of circular structures for narratives like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, that like there's a kind of a story arc that maybe, or I shouldn't say arc, a story circle that characters are supposed to go through, that Achilles is somehow trying, or Achilles is somehow trying to subvert. We might also think of that, again, for a 90s writer who has the benefit of science fiction writing, unlike some of our other writers. You might think of the fact of like trying to go back in time and interrupt the circle of time, and then instead falling to the loop, that time is always going to loop back on itself. You can't actually alter the past. That creates a paradox and won't actually work. But I don't know. I'm just kind of having fun with that a little bit. What I want to come back to especially is Electra's notion of doom. That in Greek myth, Achilles' fate always looms before him in the future, right? He has limited time to make his name in history before his inevitable death in the time to come. And in Walcott's dream vision, Achilles' fate is his past. He thinks he can reverse time, reverse the course of the river, something like the river ocean, maybe in Homer, that surrounds the world. But the loop of that river, the loop of time, the circle of time, closes. He can't actually go back and change it. So another argument about what the post-colonial poet can do. Challenged, and here I'm going to think in Fanon's terms, challenged to rediscover the pre-colonial culture that is behind him, and galvanized to fight for his people, Walcott's hero Achilles engages in two of the categories of colonial literature that Fanon imagines, or post-colonial literature, a pre-combat and a combat literature, trying to restore an indigenous culture and go back to that, or just trying to fight against and fight for a new national culture, a new national identity, by turning one's art and one's imagination to something actively combative and belligerent. But Achille discovers, unlike Fanon's faith in that combat literature, I think Achille discovers that he is fated to history, that there is a fate for him as there is for Achilles, but it's a fate of the past instead of a fate of the future. So Walcott has taken us through two discoveries about his past, that he cannot simply graft himself onto European tradition or into African history, and he cannot go back and revise or rewrite what happened there. There's a feeling of like you can't just go and be Odysseus or be the crew. It's going to be more complicated than that. You also can't go back to Africa and just pretend as though history didn't happen the way that it did. These are not ways of contending with the muse of history. The only way of contending with that is to really invest yourself in the present and in the future in your actual homeland, to return to St. Lucia. So what picture of St. Lucia do you have in your mind now, based on Walcott's verses, and I should say Walcott's paintings? These are all paintings Walcott did of his home island. I guess at one point early in his life he really considered being a painter rather than a poet. And he is a great painter, but I'm glad he didn't make that choice. So what was your image of St. Lucia by the end of this poem? What did you feel you had learned about it? What ineffable things do you feel you can now grasp? Yeah. It's a little bit like Joyce's Dublin, where we're ostensibly being given the picture of a whole culture, and yet it feels intimate. Yeah. I think when Walcott was conceding sometimes that he had written something like an epic, he would say, it might be foolhardy, but you can face an army, but you can't face a hurricane. That there is something about just the natural world in that landscape that is grand and terrifying and sublime at that level. Yeah. That's great, and I wonder whether what that's supposed to suggest for us is that some of the characters who are looking out on their homeland and defining their homeland for themselves are maybe overly fixated on aspects of the history in a way that Walcott wants the poem to correct, the way that Plunkett can only ever, at a certain point, see this island as the Helen of the West Indies that was fought over by the French and the English, that becomes kind of a screen for him of how he's able to look at it, the way that Philoctete ascribes his anchor wound as some kind of historical slave wound that will never heal. These kinds of bits of remorse and revenge, right? The literature of remorse and revenge can be so dominating to certain characters that they kind of get in the way unless they're healed in some fashion. And then Walcott has a version of that too, that Walcott is also overly preoccupied with the literary echoes of his particular island, which certainly helps him generate this wonderful poem, but I think is something he ultimately wants to get beyond. He wants to acknowledge the fact that there's this sort of overdetermined Homeric world that he lives in, that all these things are reminding him of Homer everywhere he looks, and yet he wants to be able to appreciate the land in its own respect, and so acknowledge that past, like acknowledging the Romans and the Greeks, as he said in that quote, but also being able to see the land for itself. And I love that, in your various descriptions of St. Lucia, certain symbols or emblems come to mind, the ants, the smoke, the sea. I think those are all great, and each could be worthy of its own exploration. Of course, one major symbol that Walcott's friend, Dunstan St. Omer, comes up with is the symbol of the two great volcanoes. And we might think the beach or the shore kind of surfacing in front of them. I think this also is, the black and white are also read as a sort of form of kind of racial harmony, perhaps. The blue of the sea surrounding this, that this could almost be a map as much as a flag as it is of St. Lucia. But I think if Walcott were to pick a central image for the flag, we might think of the smoke or the ants or the sea. I think all of those are good. The other one that I would add, I think, is the sea swift, right? That's a really key symbol and emblem for this poem. So what is that recurring image? What does the sea swift allow Walcott to do as his own kind of icon for his homeland? That's great. So two things that we might start with. One is that in book 2, Maud is quilting various birds into her version of Penelope's shroud, and the swift, the American black swift, is one of them. And in fact, at that very moment, Walcott says the birds flutter like little flags. So maybe there is something to this alternative flag of St. Lucia. But then the other one being that birds, when they appear in Homer, do appear as kind of omens, as representatives of something larger or higher or divine. And that, similarly, every time we see a swift cross, it seems to represent something beyond just the bird itself. Yes, so great. So a cross-pollinator that we might think of as specifically carrying the cure for certain characters like Philoctete, but maybe also carrying the seeds of ideas for Walcott, who himself is going to go out across the Atlantic and back as Achille does, and that the sea swift does that too as a migratory bird, bringing back seeds from other lands so that new things can grow in St. Lucia. That certainly feels evocative. Yeah, and I don't know if this is exactly the passage you have in mind, but just the very opening of Book 5, I crossed my meridian, rust terraces, olive trees, the gray horns of a port. Then from a cobbled corner of this mud-caked settlement founded, by legend, by Ulysses, swifts launched from the nesting sills of Ulysibona, their cries modulated to Lisbon as the Mediterranean aged into the white Atlantic, their flight in reverse, repeating the X of an hourglass, ever twitter an eon from which a horizon climbed in the upturned vase, is suggestive of the swifts as being kind of like the X on a map, or so a geographical kind of meeting point intersection, as you might feel the Caribbean certainly is, or the X of time, the X of the hourglass that Walcott is continually going to turn over and over and over, the way he can watch, this X of a bird kind of wheel and turn. He's able to do some really wonderful things when he sees the swifts also in Europe. Yeah, lovely. One other thing that you may not know or may not have picked up on is that swift is also an epithet applied to Achilles in the Iliad. He is swift-footed Achilles, as it is often translated in English. There's also, as we know from various evocations of the poem, the sign of the Christian cross seems to be visible in the cruciform image of the swift. So all in all, a cross-pollinator, a kind of meeting point, a symbol of migration and intersection, a kind of perfect image. Okay, so as we consider Walcott's unique perspective on his homeland, himself embodying migration and intersection like the swift, I want to give you here two more famous post-colonial critics to think with, who offer language for their own modern experience of exile and hybridity, things that we might associate with the flying cross of the swift. So first we have Edward Said reflecting on how much of modern literature seems to be about exile and migration at the end of the 20th century, and what vision that potentially offers to writers. When he writes, "Seeing the entire world as a foreign land makes possible originality of vision. Most people are principally aware of one culture, one setting, one home. Exiles are aware of at least two. And this plurality of vision gives rise to an awareness of simultaneous dimensions, an awareness that, to borrow a phrase from music, is contrapuntal." So like a counterpointed fugue of different musical phrases playing off each other and yet harmonizing. For an exile, habits of life, expression, or activity in the new environment inevitably occur against the memory of these things in another environment. Thus, both the new and the old environments are quite vivid, actual, occurring together, contrapuntally. There is also a particular sense of achievement in acting as if one were at home wherever one happens to be. So that term that I've put in bold several times that Said returns to, the contrapuntal, the idea that a post-colonial writer overlays musical phrases of the new and the old, the familiar and the foreign, a bit maybe like a Greek calypso might do. We've seen Walcott doing that. One way of thinking about what exile offers, or what travel offers, even to the one coming home or making his home elsewhere. Then we have the critic Homi Bhabha, perhaps reflecting on the post-colonial territory itself and what happens to a territory that has been occupied and then left to its own independence, coining a concept of a third space that gets created in such a place, that is created in acts of communication between I and you, or author and audience. It is significant, he writes, that the productive capacities of this third space have a colonial or post-colonial provenance. To that end, we should remember that it is the the cutting edge of translation and negotiation, the in-between, that carries the burden of meaning in culture. It makes it possible to begin envisaging national, anti-nationalist histories of the people. It is in this space that we will find those words with which we can speak of ourselves and others, and by exploring this hybridity, this third space, we may elude the politics of polarity and emerge as the others of ourselves. This feels also like an appropriate quote for what we were thinking about with regard to Ellison and Joyce when we were considering, the binocular vision and pluralist politics that maybe Bloom and The Invisible Man are able to arrive at. So in addition to the idea of a third space, we have that term hybridity, I think, is quite important, recognizing that so much of post-colonial culture is in one way or another combinatory of the different cultures that have existed there. And I'm intrigued with regard to Omeros in particular with this idea of emerging as the others to ourselves, because with regard to the final books of Walcott's poem, it's not just St. Lucia that becomes familiar and foreign, the way that Said would have it. It's also a kind of doubling of familiarity and foreignness that applies to Walcott himself. That's where I want to end in my arguments with Walcott. So here's how Seven Seas, one of our Homer characters, describes a similar idea of hybridity and exile and third spaces and othering of oneself to Walcott. I think summing up also the whole project of Omeros, at least in my estimation. There are two journeys in every Odyssey, one on worried water, the other crouched and motionless, without noise. For both the eye is a mast, a desk is a raft, for one foaming with paper and dipping the beak of a pen in its foam, while an actual craft carries the other to cities where people speak a different language or look at him differently, while the sun rises from the other direction with its unsettling shadows. But the right journey is motionless, as the sea moves round an island that appears to be moving. Love moves round the heart with encircling salt. And the slowly traveling hand knows it returns to the port from which it must start. Therefore, this is what this island has meant to you, why my bust spoke, why the sea swift was sent to you, to circle yourself and your island with this art. Beautiful lines, but is it actually clear by the end of this section what it means, how to answer these kind of cryptic questions, what this island has meant to you and what the sea swift was sent to you? Like, what is Seven Seas saying to Walcott about what he might have learned from his two Odysseys? That's great. So kind of per Said's point, either when you go outward, you are taking the island with you. Also, when you come back, you've taken the adventure and brought it back home to a point that you can understand your own homeland as being, a ship on the ocean as well. That's really nice. That's great. Maybe another way of thinking about the salt and the foam is that there's also this churning that is happening, like the beating of the drum, that's interior, and that you are also, Walcott is also reckoning with, each man being his own island and how to come home to that individual. And actually, in that respect, that's sort of where I want to go with this reading. So I'll get there in a minute, but this is partly about the island of St. Lucia, but I think it is also about the island of the self, and about the sea and foam and crashing and being lost, the transcendental or existential homelessness that we've talked about before, and finding your way out of that. And so, just to recap, there are two Odysseys that are promised. One of which is an Odyssey of the imagination, of the imagination of the artist, that is taken from the desk, where the foam is just the foam of papers, which is an image I really love. That gives us the concluding words of this particular section. This art is kind of the close of the final rhyme. And then we have a second Odyssey that I can put in blue, that is the one of exploring, that also has some value. The Odyssey of the traveler, the Odyssey on a ship. That gives us actually the start of that particular rhyme. This is a triplicate Danteist rhyme, actually. We have heart, start, and art. But I'm going to focus on especially the start and the art. And together, the goal of those two adventures is to circle yourself with poetry and with experience. And that's exactly what Walcott's verses do when he alters his Dantean rhyme scheme to use the word you, or meant to you and sent to you, twice in a quick couplet succession within the circle of the start and the art. He uses the start, the journey, the outward Odyssey, and the art, the poetry, the inward Odyssey, to encircle himself with that salt, with that surf, and in fact, to encircle a double self, right? A double self that is explorer and poet, the self on the island and the self that follows the sea swift. As Said puts it, a self that is contrapuntal, that is able to exist on two different phrases that rhyme with one another, in exile but also at home, or per Homi Bhabha, a kind of hybrid and other to himself, that is two things internally, and is able to see itself from outside such that it is doubled. I think that is one of the really magical things of this particular speech that Seven Seas gives. So, to put that together and answer our second question, after Derek Walcott faces the Hades of history, what does he find in the Ithaca of St. Lucia? We could say that with his experience as a traveler, the first Odyssey, and his vision as a poet, the second, however you want to order them, Walcott sees himself and his island doubled. Contrapuntal, hybrid, whichever of those theoretical terms best speaks to you perhaps, but certainly other to itself, and therefore replicated. He is both Odysseus and Omeros, the artist and the adventurer. St. Lucia is both Hades and Ithaca. It is both a place of history and a place of home. Okay, now how to write a conclusion. So let's say that's the thesis and that's the final argument. Let's rush through this so we can take a break. But as is our wont, I also want to try to read backward a little bit at this moment and ask, now how do we find the St. Lucia that is in Ithaca? What does this double vision reveal about Homer's Book 13 when Odysseus makes his own return? If you think about this lecture as a model for a paper, I propose this is the way you might consider ending a paper. Here's a new final idea that's tangential to the main argument that I consider proven, hopefully, but emerging from that argument as a new insight. And the question for that conclusion is, what does our trip to St. Lucia tell us about Homer's Ithaca? So first we have to reckon with this strange thing that Walcott says to Omeros about the Iliad and the Odyssey in Book 7. He says, I never read it. I never read your poetry, not all the way through. And then the lift of the arching eyebrows paralyzed me like Medusa's shield, and I turned cold the moment I had said it. And then he's kind of babbling. Those gods with hyphens like Hollywood producers, I heard my mouth babbling as ice glazed over my chest. The gods and the demigods, they aren't much use to us. Forget the gods, Omeros growled, and read the rest. So I think my first question has to be, is it plausible that Walcott didn't actually read the Odyssey and the Iliad before writing this poem? Is that believable? It's funny to think about. I also wonder about the plausibility of Omeros' response. Would it be possible to read Homer without reading the gods? Could you leave the gods out and would it still make sense? What do we think about that proposition? Well, I'm gonna take us through a couple test cases of whether we could remove the gods. So we might look at the moment that Odysseus returns to Ithaca, and it does seem here like the gods play a pretty undeniable role. Right? Odysseus, meanwhile, awoke from sleep in his ancestral land and did not recognize it. He had been gone so long, and Pallas Athena had spread haze all around. The goddess wanted to explain things to him and disguise him, so that his wife and dear ones would not know who he was until he had made the arrogant suitors pay for their outrage. So everything on Ithaca now looked different to its lord: the winding trails, the harbors, the towering rocks, and the trees. Odysseus sprang to his feet and gazed at his homeland. He groaned, smacked his thighs and with his hands, and in a voice choked with tears said, "What land have I come to now?" He uses that stock phrase, which is so poignant when he uses it with regard to his own homeland. Who knows what kind of people live here, lawless savages or God-fearing men who take kindly to strangers? Where am I going to take all these things? Where am I going to go myself? And if we test out what Omeros tells Walcott, it does unlock something else in these verses. Odysseus, meanwhile, awoke from sleep in his ancestral land and did not recognize that he had been gone so long, so everything on Ithaca looked different to its lord. I don't know if this works as well in Greek as it does with Lombardo's translation, but I actually think there's something in some of these moments that's a little bit believable about taking the gods out and understanding what happens as a result as psychological rather than metaphysical, right? That sometimes Athena does things to you and you ascribe it to an outside influence, a divine influence, but it might also be parts of the self or parts of the soul or parts of the mind. And in this particular case, it is sort of plausible that after 20 years, Odysseus simply doesn't recognize his home. And in fact, Homer gives us a glimpse of that too, even before he says, oh, right, because Athena had put a fog over it. A slightly trickier one, if we kind of go on with Athena and Odysseus. Now let's see about disguising you. First, I'll shrivel the skin on your gnarly limbs and wither your tawny hair. A piece of sailcloth will make a nice ugly cloak. Then we'll make those beautiful eyes bleary and dim. You'll look disgusting to all the suitors as well as to the wife and child you left behind in your halls. But you should go first to your swineherd. So it's a little bit hard to work with the magic and myth of Odysseus constantly changing forms when he needs to be glorious or when he needs to be a beggar. But again, there is an element of it that is a little bit believable, at least at times, that Odysseus, after 20 years away, has simply grown old and might actually not be recognizable and welcome at home, and that he might need to go to a friendly face outside the palace before he just suddenly announces himself to his wife. And I think it is telling that Odysseus' first stop is to the swineherd. When he returns, he is, as a matter of fact, no longer a king. He's a stranger, he's alone, he's without his crew, he's without his soldiers, he's without the gifts that the Phaeacians, he has the gifts that the Phaeacians have given him, but he has to kind of hide those away for risk of being jumped upon and having them stolen. So when Odysseus comes back to Ithaca, and this is a bit Walcott-like maybe, he has to re-experience it anew. And specifically, he has to re-experience it from the bottom. Before he can live in the palace again, he has to live in a hut. And the reason I bring that up is that I think it kind of ties things together, both with Walcott but also with the Hades episode, that with his experience as a traveler and his return as a beggar, Odysseus is also doubled, as we were arguing for Walcott. He has to rediscover a home that is now foreign to him, and he himself is a foreigner to his people. And in that respect, he takes on Achilles' bargain. He was once a warrior king and was esteemed as such and had glory as such, but when he first shows up on Ithaca, he now has to see his home anew from the hut of a hired hand, the bargain that Achilles was willing to take, and to test that out, to see what that life is actually like and whether you're willing to endure that way or whether you have to commit a slaughter to regain the life of glory and the life of a king. And with all this in mind, this idea of splitting the self and understanding oneself and being doubled, there is one final slide and one final coda I will offer you to bring it back to Walcott. That is just a beautiful quote of his from a different essay that I also really recommend, an essay that happens to be about epic and reflecting on what tradition of epic means in the Antilles, in the Caribbean. And Walcott, in trying to describe that, comes up with this metaphor. Break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than the love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. And I think that's a memorable metaphor for everything we've been describing in this lecture, and especially where the lecture has ended. You can break tradition and myth into pieces of idolatry or revenge and put it back like the soldering of two great worlds. You can break apart a homeland into its difficult history and its enduring beauty, and you can see it as an Edenic fruit seamed together with the bitter juice of knowledge. And you can break apart your own identity and put it back into a double self. In Walcott's case, into different continental ancestries, into identifications with both writers and fishermen, into the traveler and the artist on two different Odysseys, or in Odysseus' case, as a renowned hero, but a man who is also aging, a king who also now has to live as a beggar, who's lost everything he knows, a stranger in his own land. It is the act of reconstituting yourself after having been fragmented that comes out to a love of self and then ultimately to a love of home.